Hi, and welcome to our Tertulias Cities edition on behalf of the Tertulia organizers, Daniel Tubb from University of New Brunswick, Tracy Glynn, Matthew Hayes, and myself from St. Thomas University. We want to welcome you this evening. We'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land that the organizers are located on is the unceded territory of the Whisquahic people covered by the treaties of peace and friendship. We ask, I think, that you consider the ways that colonial relations of power work to structure access to land. I think this is especially pertinent tonight while we're talking about access to cities and urban spaces. So if we could keep that in our minds as we proceed through the talk. The talk this evening is sponsored by the NB Media Co-op, by Raven, or the Rural Action and Voices for the Environment, the Atlantic Regional Solidarity Network, and book publishers Fernwood, Between the Lines, Verso, Canadian Scholars, and Women's Scholars Press. We want to remind you that the Tertulias Cities edition is a two-event run, and next week on May 5th at 7:30 p.m. we'll be focusing on social justice in the city of New Brunswick, and we'll be joined by guests Rachel Bryant, Julia Woodhull, Melnick, and Valeria Edelman. So we hope that that you'll come back and join us for that event as well. But without further ado, I'm going to turn the mic over to Matthew Hayes so he can introduce tonight's speaker.
Thank you, Christy. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here. Tonight's speaker is Leslie Kern. She's an associate professor of geography and environment, and she's director of women's and gender studies at Mount Allison University here in New Brunswick. She's the author of Sex and the Revitalized City, Gender, Condominium Development, and Urban Citizenship with UBC Press. And her most recent book, the topic of tonight's conversation, is Feminist City, published by Verso and Between the Lines. Tonight's discussion is going to look pretty much like a lot of other tertulias. Dr. Kern is going to speak for a little bit. Then we have a series of questions that we'll be going through to tease out some of the main themes in the book. And then we'll open it up to questions and answers. So without further ado, Leslie, it's great to have you here. Thank you so much. We're looking forward to hearing about your book. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Matthew, and thank you to the organizers of this event for inviting me. It's really lovely to have a chance to talk to a New Brunswick audience, although I guess I should confess that as I was writing Feminist City, probably New Brunswick cities were not really at the top of my mind when I was both recalling my own experiences of living in big cities like Toronto and London, and also, looking at research on gender and cities from places around the world. So my apologies for overlooking New Brunswick, as pretty much everybody always does. So that being said, tonight I have the opportunity to throw out some questions really for what I think New Brunswick municipalities, as we're moving towards an election, could be considering as guidelines, principles, values, ways of thinking about urban spaces, or even, small cities, even rural areas, in some cases, or small towns like Sackville, where I am right now. What kinds of questions could maybe guide us towards like a more feminist urban reality here in New Brunswick? So I thought I would just talk about kind of 4 topics. They are certainly not the only ones that we could touch on, but they are kind of maybe a good jumping off place for further discussion. So I'm going to throw out some comments and questions about each of these topics, and then certainly would be happy to hear questions and comments from other people, especially in different cities in New Brunswick where some of these issues might be playing out in different ways, or ways that you could speak to with more expertise than I can. So the first thing I thought I would talk about is housing. So housing is really kind of a foundational element of any conception, I think, of a feminist city. It's very hard to imagine some of the perhaps higher or more lofty or even more revolutionary ideas of a feminist city without thinking about the fact that people need somewhere safe and secure and affordable to live. Now, in New Brunswick, certainly, in the city closest to me, Moncton, and more widely in the province recently, there's been some discussion, debate, denial perhaps about whether there is in fact a housing affordability problem in New Brunswick, whether there is a housing crisis of any sort. But it certainly seems that, at least anecdotally, many people are reporting that over the last several years, and this has become really heightened over the last year during the pandemic, that affordability is kind of at an all-time low, that people are facing evictions, and that the supply of rental housing is very limited, and people are finding that there are very limited choices to make. So having this debate about whether housing is a problem in New Brunswick, like, it's frustrating that that's where the conversation is rather than on what we could actually be doing about it. So what could municipalities be talking about, thinking about, asking as they hopefully tackle housing issues? Well, are we tracking things like evictions in terms of gender related data, family status, and so on? Typically, women and mothers are at high risk for eviction. And in some cases, I'm not necessarily talking about New Brunswick, but more generally, women and mothers can be deliberately targeted for eviction. So I think it's important that we have this data if we want to, kind of understand the scope of the problem. In general, women are often more vulnerable to displacement as prices rise. We have, an ongoing wage gap issue. And of course, women are more likely to be primary caregivers of children if they're in a single parent household. So their living costs are higher because they have to provide space for children as well. So asking questions like, are we seeing gentrification? I mean, maybe this has not really been a conversation in many New Brunswick cities, the question of whether gentrification is a problem, but definitely over the last year, hearing all of these stories of people from out of province wanting to move to places like New Brunswick, shockingly, and perhaps driving up housing prices, I think we do need to have a conversation about whether gentrification is happening and how it is impacting women and other vulnerable groups. It's also true that in most places, women are more likely to be public housing tenants or social housing tenants. So what are we doing to increase the supply of social housing, to reduce wait lists, to improve living conditions, and to create opportunities for people to move on and to move out of social housing, but still into affordable, central, good quality housing? And of course, we know that there is a homelessness problem here in many New Brunswick cities, and homelessness often looks different for men and women. Women are more likely to be kind of invisibly homeless, like living in shelters, like domestic violence shelters, and so on. So we often maybe don't think about women as much when we think about homelessness, because they're not as highly represented in terms of street homelessness, although they are part of that population as well. So we need to ask some questions about gender and homelessness. What specific dangers are women facing? What's driving them into homelessness here in New Brunswick? What are their particular needs to support them from moving out of homelessness? How are they, dealing with issues of safety, danger, policing, and so on the streets of New Brunswick cities? So the next topic that I wanted to talk about is domestic violence, which is very much connected to housing issues. So in New Brunswick, women are at a high risk of domestic violence here, and certainly of homicide or femicide from domestic partners. It's something that we hear about all too often for such a small place to hear these terrifying stories of women being seriously injured or killed by their intimate partners. And again, this is not, just a New Brunswick question, but to what extent do cities consider domestic violence to be an urban issue? That's kind of a bigger question that I pose a little bit in the book. I think here in Canada, we have maybe seen domestic violence as kind of a big social issue that maybe federal and more likely provincial governments are responsible for figuring out what to do about it and how to fund services, and municipalities kind of kick in a little bit of money towards like the immediate emergency services like domestic violence shelters or transition house services. But I don't know that we often think about domestic violence as a an issue that cities could do something about. So circling back around to housing, like what housing options are available beyond the shelter system? The shelter system is very limited in its capacity, especially in terms of the amount of time that women can spend in shelters. It's usually about 6 weeks. There's very little second stage housing, which is, housing that's still secure and subsidized, that women and their families, children can move into after they leave the temporary emergency shelter system. And there's often still a limit there. I shouldn't say often, there is a limit of about 2 years that women can stay in second stage housing. So limited supply and limited timeframes. It's also been observed in many places that women who are experiencing domestic violence may also be in danger of evictions because landlords, quite frankly, don't like having the police called to their properties on a regular basis, and they may see families where domestic violence is present as kind of a nuisance. So women can be kind of labeled as problem tenants, even if they're the victims of violence. And this can, snowball and make it harder for them to get housing in the future, especially in many towns and cities where they're small, right? People know each other, and landlords have like do not rent to lists, and people's names are published on Facebook pages saying don't rent to these people. So this can really impact women. They're facing the violence at home, and then they're facing a real lack of places to go. So I would love to see New Brunswick municipalities look seriously at the issue of domestic violence. Okay. Topic number 3, I'm kind of putting here together safety and accessibility questions together. And I'll, sorry, let me back up. Okay. So one of a combined safety and accessibility question is around pedestrian friendliness in cities. So in cities all over the world, women are less likely to have access to a private vehicle like a car. They're more likely to be public transit users, and they tend to take more pedestrian journeys during the day than men do. But many New Brunswick cities are not the most pedestrian friendly. Thinking in particular of a city like Moncton, I was reflecting as I was making my notes yesterday. I was like, what grocery store in Moncton would you realistically walk to if you were pushing a stroller or even not, right? We have just these big superstores that are surrounded by highway off-ramps and on-ramps, just, 4 lanes of traffic, transport trucks, buses, cars, very pedestrian unfriendly, and very, I would feel unsafe, walking through that environment, especially if I was like pushing a stroller or had children with me. So I think many cities here are very geared to car traffic, and there's very limited kind of downtown areas that have a pedestrian-ish vibe to them. But one of the problems there as well, and again, thinking about Moncton and our little downtown, Main Street strip, even in non-COVID times, this is not an area that is typically like bustling with people on a regular basis. It tends to be an area that clears out at certain times, aside from some of the bars and restaurants, which might be open a little bit later. But one of the things that women report in terms of feeling unsafe in urban spaces is areas where they feel isolated, where there are not people on the streets, where there aren't a variety of different businesses and services open at different times of the day. So New Brunswick cities might think about, okay, well, what can we do to encourage more of that mixed use of our downtown areas so there are not sort of big swaths of space where there's just nobody out at different times of day. There's also a tool that other cities have used called safety audits. I know that these were developed in Toronto in the 1980s, probably not exclusively in Toronto, but the Metro Action Committee on Violence Against Women developed a safety audit tool that's been widely used in many Canadian cities and university campuses. And this involves actually, gathering members of the community together to go out into public spaces or into residential neighborhoods, walk around at different times of the day, and to kind of conducted this audit that is not just about, how many streetlights are there, but it's about how do I feel in this space? Who else is here in this space? What is this space being used for? How would I like to use it? What's preventing me from using it in this way? And through this kind of participatory process, you get that, ground up everyday experience of people, and often of people who are not necessarily at the table in City Hall. They're not showing up to council meetings. They're not well represented in the sort of municipal halls of power, but this gives a chance to bring those perspectives in. Overall, questions of accessibility are not only gender questions, but they certainly intersect with gender. So when we have kind of old and crumbling infrastructure, cobblestones, sidewalks that aren't being repaired on a regular basis, then these create barriers for people to move around. Making sure that public transit is accessible is a key issue. And we could also talk in New Brunswick, we don't want to think about it right now, but we could talk about snow and snow clearing as a safety issue, an accessibility issue, and a gender issue. Again, going back to my point about women making more pedestrian trips, for example, a lack of snow clearance or the kind of piling up of huge piles of snow at the edges of curbs. It blocks sight lines, so cars can't see pedestrians and vice versa. It makes it very difficult to walk or to push a stroller, to use a mobility device. Very difficult for seniors, difficult to pull your trolley of groceries should you have happened to walk to a grocery store, to pull your laundry cart, right? Even to make deliveries, right? It affects day-to-day life for many people. So are we thinking about snow clearing from an equity perspective and not just from a, oh my God, how can we get this snow out of our way as quickly as possible perspective, or prioritizing car traffic for snow clearance rather than other forms of mobility that would help perhaps an even greater cross-section of society. Okay, so the last issue that I want to touch on is public space. So how are our indoor and outdoor public spaces in New Brunswick cities being assessed in terms of gender? So this could relate to safety, it could relate to kind of family friendliness, it could relate to the availability of things like public toilets, toilets where we can care for children or care for others who need care, toilets that are gender inclusive, toilets that are safe and clean. During the pandemic, we've all been encouraged to get out and make more use of public space for safer socializing outdoors. But people in cities all over the world are finding that many of our urban environments have not really been set up for us to do this very comfortably, right? We've taken away benches or places to sit because we're afraid of homelessness. We've closed down public washrooms, again, often for the same reason or to prevent, drug use or sex work in those spaces. We don't have a lot of, shade or shelter or access to water. So if you try to go out for a day, in urban public space with your family, you might find that you don't last very long if there's nowhere for your kids to go to the bathroom or for your elderly parent to sit down and rest. So I think we have to look at, how can we use our urban public spaces in more inclusive ways, especially if we are looking, towards a future where we might, in sort of pandemic context, like need to have these spaces available to us for our physical health and perhaps our mental health as well. I think in general, New Brunswick cities could probably do a lot to improve access to public space or to increase the sort of multi-use of our public spaces. And by this, I mean everything from our parks and squares, our river walks, our cemeteries, like what can we do with these spaces to bring more people into them? And, I'll just sort of ask, and this relates to public space, but maybe it's also relates to all of these issues that I've raised. If we were to kind of put women at the center of our planning efforts to ask feminist questions, gender-based questions, intersectional questions at the start of our planning processes, what improvements might we see for everybody in our cities in New Brunswick? So gender isn't the only place that we can start, and it's certainly not the place that we should stop, but it is one way of kind of opening up these questions of equity and inclusion in our urban environments. So I'm going to pause there and pass it back to Matthew and then for some conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. I've got my copy here of the book. I really enjoyed reading it. It's a very lively read. One of the things that you do in the book is also you talk about the city from the standpoint of the flaneuse. Can you tell us a little bit about that? What does the city look like from the perspective of the flaneuse?
So the flaneuse as a kind of female or feminine version of the flaneur, the urban observer, the watcher, the one who blends into the crowd and just kind of enjoys the urban spectacle for what it is without necessarily being an active part of it himself. Well, certainly there's been lots of conversation about whether a female version of this figure is even possible, but and so in the book I write a little bit about, it's difficult position for many women to inhabit because fully blending in and becoming kind of one with your surroundings is difficult when you need a certain amount of vigilance around your safety and comfort in cities, or when you are perhaps always being observed, objectified, or harassed or groped at worst in urban places. So it's kind of a difficult position to inhabit. Yet at the same time, I don't want to deny that women can take pleasure in those aspects of urban life and can experience feelings of that sort of pleasurable anonymity of the urban environment where kind of nobody knows you and you can blend in for a period of time. I've certainly experienced that in my life, and it was always one of the things that I loved about living in the city, and kind of a shocking, contrast to living in a place like Sackville, where that is not so possible here. Yeah, let me pause there, maybe.
Yeah, and you also talk about kind of like the daily stresses that we have in our daily lives. How this is often related to built space, the way that the city is designed. I mean, you touched on this as well in your talk about how if you live in Moncton, you need to drive to the grocery store because there's really no. I mean, I know I lived for a time in Moncton and walked to the grocery store, but it's not an easy thing to do. It's kind of like how these spaces, the spaces of the city, are designed for the lives and movement of middle-class men. How can urban planning, especially at this moment in history, urban planning and urban design kind of address how families and work life are changing? What can feminist geography kind of bring to that? To that perspective on how cities are changing?
Well, one of the things that we might think about, and there's a long history of research on this, is just the very different like gendered mobility patterns of people through the city. So I mentioned kind of car versus pedestrian, but also just the nature of the kind of trips that men versus women take in cities on a regular basis. Women are more likely to make extra stops, to have nonlinear journeys, to combine care work and paid work in their day-to-day journeys throughout the city. But as you mentioned, so much of our urban infrastructure is kind of designed for, this middle class, cis, able-bodied man who works a standard 9-to-5 job. I mean, we can ask, how many men does this work for in today's age, which I think your question is kind of getting at, right? The nature of work and family has changed so much that this kind of almost mythical character of the 9-to-5 male commuter is probably not working that well for very many people at all. So we could start to look at the different ways that people need to access different spaces in the city. The way that we've historically organized cities around downtown cores with zoning that separates out commercial and residential and other sorts of uses in urban areas also hasn't worked that well for many people, especially women who are trying to combine many more activities into their day because of uneven caregiving responsibilities. So people have put forward ideas around things like the 15-minute city, the 20-minute city, that are about trying to integrate a wider variety of services and land uses into neighborhood spaces that would make them more accessible to people. Now, as a gentrification researcher, I always will have to ask, who's going to get to access those nicely interconnected 15-minute neighborhoods? We certainly need to have kind of a class and race analysis of, who those spaces are going to end up being geared to. But, definitely like mobility and movement through the city is, I think, a good place to start to kind of bring a feminist perspective in.
And at one point in the book, you talk a little bit about gender mainstreaming. I was just wondering, I was curious about what that is because I hadn't heard about it before. But it seems as though this is used as a kind of policy paradigm in other cities.
Yeah, I mean, you might not have heard of it before because it's not all that common in North American cities to be used, but it is more common in European cities. So gender mainstreaming is essentially a policy guideline that means that for all of the decisions that are made at the city level or the municipal level, which might have to do with infrastructure, development, transit system, social services, that all of those decisions will be run through kind of a gender equity lens to ask the question, will this new park, will this bus route, will this new school, will this new housing development enhance gender equity in our city or not? So the mainstreaming part is that you're not just applying a gender lens to issues that we've traditionally decided are women's issues, but you're applying it to everything. And so in the book, I talk about a little bit about how you can apply a gender mainstreaming or feminist lens to snow clearing, right? It doesn't seem intuitive to think about snow as having an anti-feminist agenda, and it doesn't, but the way that we decide to deal with snow can reveal certain deeply built-in biases and assumptions about the city that have gendered impacts to them.
Okay. In the book as well, you talk a little bit about, and you mentioned this as well. When we think about urban spaces and gender issues, oftentimes we might think of spaces of fear, but in the book you also underscore spaces of friendship and spaces also of activism. Can you tell us a bit more about that? Like, how important is the space of the city to friendship amongst women? Or amongst other genders?
Yeah, thank you for asking about that. I mean, initially when I was writing about friendship in the city, it was, based on the fact that when I was a young adult living in Toronto and going to university and kind of being on my own for the first time, that really feeling like this shared sense of camaraderie with my women friends and a kind of shared experience of kind of finding ourselves in the city and growing up and becoming independent, yet, knowing that we kind of had each other's backs. And then, later on kind of seeing some of that represented in certain problematic ways, but nonetheless represented in television shows like Sex and the City and later things like Broad City, realizing that, space does impact the kind of relationships that we can have. But as I was writing more about female friendship in cities, kind of the place that I ended up was using friendship as a way to think about how could we kind of dismantle or at least shake loose the constricting boundaries of the traditional nuclear family as the organizing unit, both for society and for the city itself, in terms of the kind of housing options that we have. What if we start to imagine different kinds of kinship relationships? We don't even have to imagine them. They already exist, but what if we supported them, right? What if we brought them into the mainstream? What if we didn't see them as secondary to romantic partnership and monogamy? What if we, widened that and imagined, what kinds of housing situations, what kind of social services, what kind of legal arrangements we could use to shore up a multitude of different family and kinship forms. And so friendship is kind of one way of, entering into that conversation as well. Activism as well, thinking back to my own experiences as a young person in the city, realizing that taking part in protests and even in events that are less protesty, like Pride and so on, was another way of connecting to the city, and maybe not one that we often think about in relation to gender, right? We don't often have narratives of how women actively claim space in the city. We see this more played out in kind of typical male narratives, sometimes kind of problematically, like claiming the city through acts of violence or and so on with young men and various ways that they're portrayed in popular culture. But we rarely see examples of that with women, or the examples that we see are limited to kind of like consumption activities, right? Going shopping, going to brunch, the Sex and the City kind of life, right? But we don't, like, would we see, Carrie and Samantha at a Black Lives Matter rally now if Sex and the City was kind of, well, I guess we will see if they're rebooting it. I guess we will see. I don't really want to see. I don't really want to know, but I'm not really confident that will be well done. But more generally, can we think about these different ways that women and other groups do claim space and claim a connection to the city? Yeah.
Cool. I got a couple more questions, but I don't want to take up all the space. I noticed we've got a couple of questions now in the chat. If anybody else would like to add their questions in the chat, or if you want to just raise your hand, we'll go to you to voice that. And Lauren Korn, you're first, and I understand you would like to voice your question. So it's over to you if you like.
Oh, hi, Leslie. Yeah, my question is basically, where are these conversations about planning and space, these intersectional conversations, where are they being had right now, or are they being had in New Brunswick? Do you see those conversations being had when it comes to design and planning right now?
Hi, Lauren. Really nice to see you again. Thank you for the question. It's a great question, and I wish I had a better answer. I don't. In terms of how those conversations might be happening in the like official spaces of planning, I don't know. I don't know that they are. I don't want to say that they're not, but I haven't seen it. I don't know of it. I mean, to me, I think probably the things that are perhaps pushing some of that would be things like Black Lives Matter and the way that, that did touch down in cities in New Brunswick, and the kind of conversations that movement sparks, obviously about policing as kind of the maybe front runner issue there, but then, much deeper conversations about segregation in cities, exclusion of different groups of people. These are also, to me, feminist conversations, or as you say, intersectional conversations about, how New Brunswick cities are dealing with difference, with inequality, with discrimination. And my hope would be that those the conversations that were kind of sparked last summer are not completely kind of being pushed to the wayside now as we head into another municipal election cycle.
That's good. Jesse Taylor, you had a question too. Hi, Jesse. Go ahead.
Howdy. I did have a question. I wanted to circle back to something that you said that I thought was so well articulated, which is you mentioned that the discussion about the housing crisis in New Brunswick right now is really focused on whether it's a problem instead of how to fix it, as if that's somehow debatable. And I, as an activist, and I feel like almost everybody on this call that I recognize will recognize this sort of derailment tactic, because it's often used to disrupt and distract from any kind of action, any kind of movement forward, any kind of ability to like create change or fix something that's a problem. We always get derailed in a debate whether it's really a problem, and it's really exhausting. It's exhausting because also like all of the work then goes on to people to have to to do fake work to prove that something is a problem when it's just so obvious. And was wondering if you had any suggestions about like strategies for preventing that derailment or reorienting those discussions.
Oh, such a great question. And yeah, I very much like relate to everything that you just described there, because it's so kind of hard to see that conversation kind of constantly just like seeming to go in these circles. Gosh, how do we not let it get derailed in that way? I mean, sometimes we might have to kind of hold our noses and try to speak the language that is heard by those in power in New Brunswick, which is what is the economic impact of this? Like, what is the cost of, for example, ongoing homelessness versus affordable housing, housing first programs, those sorts of things, right? Like we might have to make a kind of slightly neoliberal economic argument about it. Like it's expensive to have homelessness in your cities. It's expensive to have people getting evicted. Like this is not something that you actually want to have happening. So, trying to show that there is like an economic benefit of addressing a housing problem. The other thing that I can think of is just like at the moment, it seems as though there maybe isn't quite enough data or data that those in power want to pay attention to really illustrate the housing problem beyond homelessness, but more in terms of, rents going up, evictions, so on. So making sure that we have, highly skilled researchers and groups that are paying attention to the problem and making sure that that information is getting, kind of fed up, up the food chain, if you will. But yeah, I wish I had better suggestions than that. I mean, it's frustrating. It's a frustrating political and kind of cultural context in New Brunswick as well. There's not that much like discursive space sometimes for broadening that conversation.
Is it also about kind of challenging the narrative a little bit or creating space for other ways of talking about the city? I mean, yeah, it's true that it's kind of a public sphere that's dominated by economic arguments. But what about right to the city? Is it possible to create space for that? And can feminist geography also help us draw attention to some of the issues that we're facing around various forms of housing precarity that need to be addressed?
Yeah, I mean, the right to the city, the idea of right to the city, one of the things that I'm thinking about right now, and I'm sorry if this goes on a bit of a tangent, it's just kind of something that I've been writing about recently, is thinking about what right to the city from a feminist perspective looks like. Housing is a part of it, but it's also, I think, about care work. And this is really heightened again in the time of the pandemic, when the invisible, private, exploited nature of care work in the private space of the home has suddenly become like a visible problem again for many people. So to me, a feminist right to the city has to also think about how do we collectivize that care work? How do we destigmatize that care work? How do we value it properly? How do we share it? How do we pay it well for when it is done in the paid work environment? So I think all cities, and definitely New Brunswick cities as well, have a long way to go towards really seeing care work as having, well, it does have economic value to the extent that we can't have this thing called the economy without it, but actually acknowledging that, right? And actually building that into our systems, whether that is through childcare, whether that's through thinking about what kinds of public spaces we can use for care work, whether that's making sure that the necessity of care work is literally built into the design of buildings and spaces from the ground up, instead of being this afterthought that, like, oh, let's shove a change table in here and that'll be fine. And that's it, care work taken care of, right? But we kind of need to really like just totally flip that conversation.
That's yeah, I really liked the stuff that you wrote in the book around care. I find it like something that really kind of expanded my view of the city and what progressive projects for transforming the city would be about. So I wanted to thank you, especially for that contribution in the book. You also write that the city provides women with all the support that traditional marriage, I'm quoting you here, the city provides women with all the support that traditional marriage was meant to provide and a great deal more freedom to boot. Can you tell us a bit more about some of those supports? What are some of those supports that the city provides? And do we have them here? Do we have those here in New Brunswick?
Do we have those here? I mean, I think what I was getting at was the, you know, when things are going well, the city offers all of the kind of services, right, that can support women in their, you know, caregiving and paid work functions. It does have more possibility of spreading out that care work, not that it is, not that it's really been done as well as it could, but it has that potential more so than, say, the suburbs or rural and small town areas. But overall, I mean, I think, again, some of the problems that I pointed to in my initial remarks about New Brunswick City is like a kind of lack of walkability in many areas, you know, that close connectedness of those services is that support network, right? It's not just that they exist, but it's that they exist in place, right? And that the place matters and the local context matters. So, you know, cities like Moncton, for example, have been sprawling so much in recent decades as the population really grows, and there's almost like a total lack of planning for those new sprawling areas, and they're, you know, not well connected by transit, they're not walkable, they're kind of their own little like budding hives off of the main hub of Moncton. And without that kind of, you know, careful planning at the outset, then I think, you know, the city is not providing all of those things that it, you know, ideally could provide for women and others as well.
I noticed that Samantha Lyons had a comment about housing co-ops. Samantha, did you want to add anything? Do you have a question?
It just made me think of that, everything, kind of connecting everything you're speaking about. Of course, the big egg for Christmas, sure. Okay, it's totally silent until just now. I know I'm trying to get a hold my friend. I'm trying to ask her what it was called. She's from the Halifax area, but lives here. And I remember her sharing something that some sort of project had just received this funding, but it was a women's co-op housing cooperative. So, and then, I mean, I think that might be a way to look at things, because we were talking about like friendship and spaces too. If you have this really like safe, the safe space, and it's women and children. So there's also this like cohesion of, maybe there's, a little playground in the middle and people are helping each other. Because I'm a single mom. I know it can be very challenging to live in this individualist neoliberal world where, nobody talks to each other. Like, I could use some help if I lived around, if I lived in a neighborhood that was more inviting and we had so the spaces, I agree, they're definitely not considered from different perspectives, but right now it would be the time to start demanding to have these conversations, because like with people from bigger cities moving in, and this is attracting tax money for cities, they're more interested probably in the luxury apartments and the tax that can come with that than thinking about it for their community members.
Yeah, I mean, women's housing co-ops and women-centered co-housing, the interesting thing is that there is actually a history of this in Canada. Like in the 70s and 80s, there were many of these projects built in cities like Calgary, Toronto, Ottawa, if I remember incorrectly. My own PhD supervisor did research on this way back in the day. But that was in a period where the federal government was still like providing money for social housing and for innovative different sorts of housing projects. But in the kind of, the rise of the neoliberal 80s and 90s, so much of that funding kind of dried up. It was all downloaded to the provinces, downloaded to the municipalities. So because it's much more profitable to build condos and luxury apartment buildings than it is to build co-ops and co-housing things. So a lot of those different kinds of housing forms and ways that people might live together have, or the funding for them has dried up because they're not things that likely, the private market is going to build on its own. But on the other hand, more optimistically, there is like a co-housing movement in Canada. It's often being geared or marketed towards seniors who, want and maybe need more community around them, but don't need to be in a care home kind of environment. But yeah, just like you said, I mean, they have garden spaces in the center. They have shared cooking spaces, social spaces, green spaces, gardening, right? And this, not just for seniors, but you can imagine that for families, children, low-income people, people with disabilities, like all sorts of people who need or just want to kind of live like that. So if you look up like co-housing Canada, you can see some examples of it. So maybe, as the population ages and we've seen the horrors of long-term care in this country over the last year, maybe it's a moment where people will be like, hey, we don't want to live like this anymore. What are our options?
Yeah, you can, sorry, go ahead.
I think I was just gonna say, yeah, I agree. But one thing that I heard about just recently, I was down by in Fredericton, we have the racetrack behind the Frex, or the Frex, it's called the Frex. I was talking to somebody there, and that space now, because they haven't had the horse races for a couple of years, and that's like a pretty kind of historical agricultural space. I think it used to be farming there. And so right now they're talking about building apartments there. And then there's an other side of it that would like to, that's proposing this idea to make it a therapeutic horse, like for horse therapy, and make it this like the center of the province where people can go to experience that. So that's like a debate on two sides of it, like build high apartments or keep it in this sort of community space. Yeah. I don't know if anyone's heard of that, but
I did see that they were planning to do something there on the Frex land. We'll have to see if it is gender mainstreamed. I'm not positive, but Ruth Breen is here, and hopefully she'll be on council after the municipal election, and she can maybe push for that. I notice Katie. There's Ruth. Katie Harrington had a question. I'm going to go to her. Katie, would you like to voice your question?
More of just a comment than a question, I guess. I just think that the concept of the mixed income housing and changing, like that was kind of the things that I took to be like, it just made so much sense, even though I never thought of it before, like how like everything is set into be the nuclear family and is kind of set for a nuclear straight family with like middle to high income, and how we really need to change that perspective. But yeah, my comment was just how, like, just as an example of it, my urban politics prof in St. John, where I lives in a building similar to that in Uptown. So it's mixed income. And so she lives in a building with also that has lower income people, particularly seniors. And I personally would love that. Like, that would be my dream, is to live in an apartment building where there's a bunch of seniors that I can help out, and just knowing that that's a demographic that is being taken care of and having that bigger sense of community, kind of like you mentioned in the book, how we need to prioritize relationships that aren't just romantic. I just think I don't get, and I don't know why I didn't think of it before, but I think it's something that we really need to push in the future. I just feel like it has so many positive impacts that people might not even think of. Like there's definitely more than one benefit of that. So yeah, that's something I really enjoyed reading about in the book.
Yeah, thank you for your comment. And I think, yeah, the idea of intergenerational housing is one that we really need to pay a lot more attention to here. Again, not only do we have a demographically aging population here in Canada and in many other countries as well, but we, as I said, we've seen the serious failures of what has come to pass for long-term care. And of course, there will always be a need for long-term care, but we don't have a lot of like kind of in between options, especially for lower income seniors. Like, sure, if you have a lot of money, you can afford to live in kind of a nice, supportive living environment with other seniors and so on. But for your, average or lower income senior, often who are women, right, who are the ones who live longer and who are more likely to be low income, to have less pension funds to rely on in retirement, et cetera, et cetera. Thinking about what other modes of housing and community we could have. And I think, there are some examples, in Europe of this kind of seniors living with like university students in kind of, it's like a dorm, but it's for both seniors and young people. And yeah, not everyone wants to live like that, but here we don't even have the option to try it in most places. So let's at least make it an option for people.
Are there any other questions out there that anybody has? Samantha, you've got a comment there? Go for it.
I was just saying that what you were talking about with matching students with seniors who are living in their home. That's a pilot project that's currently happening, but it's been sort of put on hold because of the pandemic here in Fredericton. Yeah, that is a great idea. Yeah.
Hopefully it will get picked up again when things are a bit safer. Yeah.
I'm not seeing too many other questions. I've got a few more lined up, I guess. One that I think is really interesting that comes out of your work is how a municipal platform would be based. So much of municipal governments, just the kind of the concerns that councils or mayors deal with, is about managing the city from the vantage point of increasing income. Thinking about space also in terms of development and increasing income and tax revenue and increasing economic activity. And what you're drawing attention to is really that an important part of living in a city is also about thinking about space in terms of support, in terms of care work. The municipal campaign, at least in Fredericton, perhaps elsewhere in the province as well, has really underscored the importance of having women on council. Do you think having women on council will help to bring forward, an alternative vision or an alternative agenda that might be more inclusive of, issues around care and support?
Yeah, definitely. I think that increased diversity of representation across all sorts of groups is so important. It's not, the magic bullet that automatically means that we suddenly transform into a, feminist council or anti-racist or intersectional, city council of some sort. But I kind of like to say, like, planners, city councilors, mayors, you kind of can't imagine the solutions to problems that you're not even aware of, right? Either because you haven't lived them or they're just not on your radar, right? So having a greater, diverse representation at the table means that there's more likely to be people who've had different life experiences or who are aware of different sorts of issues and how they impact different groups in the city. So, a town council might think, okay, poverty is an issue, but like poverty is kind of an abstract concept in many ways, right? It's very different than thinking about, okay, single mother living in a housing project, what time does she get up in the morning? What bus does she catch? How does she get the kids to school? What job options are available for her? Where does she have to stand in line to get, access to this social service? Like the day-to-day nitty-gritty of it is where I think cities, ideally cities can intervene on that day-to-day level, right? They can make that day-to-day life better. And sometimes it is just like a closer bus stop can like change somebody's life, right? So, or better public toilets, like these things can make a real difference on a day-to-day basis. And cities have a lot of power or opportunity to do that. So yeah, making sure that you're hearing from as many people as possible is going to increase the chances that those issues are actually going to be addressed.
Ruth Breen, you have your hand up.
Thanks. Actually, I was just going to comment, and you basically just said it. It's the mainstream oblivion that happens on a traditional council, and I'm not 100% confident that a change in gender will take away that mainstream oblivion, because all of the candidates from Frederick, the women candidates, are also from the mainstream, and also white middle class. So I think there's a real role for you folks to also claim spaces to advise council. The work that you do every day and the research that you do every day should be where council is going to when they're looking for policy advice. And if you can wiggle your way onto standing committees that advise council decision makings, that would connect the dots. So having more women on council, I think, is critical. Obviously, it's, but are we going to be able to make the change depending on how many of us get on? I think having that secondary leadership in standing committees and every policy, supporting role along the way is really important.
Yeah, totally agree. Yeah, it's great.
Any other questions out there? It sounds also like we need some feminist geography in our public discourse even. Like, these are issues that, when you talk to students, when you talk to students about the suburbs and how this represents a particularly historical form of the family that has changed quite a bit. And do we still want to live in these type of spaces? How might we modify these spaces? But we have this kind of government working to and development industry working basically to reproduce it. Seems kind of irrational. Like, what kind of reaction do they have to that?
That's a good question. I mean, I think in my experience with the students that I have, many of them are very amenable to kind of hearing about this, relationship between society and space. But I think, yeah, what's kind of lacking maybe even in people who like literally work in and with the city for a living is that understanding that it's not just us who, as humans who kind of make decisions about how space will function, but those spaces are shaping our lives, right? Those spaces are not like just inert, they're not just containers, they are actors in a way. They're not necessarily conscious actors, but they are affecting us. They have an impact on us in very real ways, on the kind of relationships that we can have, the kind of work that we can do or can't do, the life chances, our very like health and well-being is very much impacted by a place. So simply, whether it's from a explicitly feminist perspective or not, but just having that kind of tweak for people. And that was also partly why I wrote the book, so that people would look around their environments and think, oh yeah, like, what is this place doing to me? Like, how is it acting upon me and shaping my life? And I think if we could start to see that relationship more clearly, then that might be a step towards like that understanding of, oh yeah, what we do with these spaces really matters.
It sure does matter. Any other questions here from people who are present? I think a lot of, I see some, you know, the people who have their cameras on certainly seem to be like nodding, smiling, you know, this has been a really engaging talk. It's also a really engaging book. I certainly really enjoyed reading it. You know, this is a book that talks a lot. It focuses on your experiences in London and in Toronto. It talks a little bit about New York as well, which are very large cities, which, you know, as a New Brunswicker, hope to get back to someday. Right now, in the midst of the pandemic, we're not able to get to large metropolitan areas. But are there lessons also for New Brunswick cities here? What lessons does the book have for the spaces here, for the relatively smaller cities that we have here?
Yeah, I mean, I think the question of you know, the size of the city is not that's yeah, it's not that critical. I mean, the lessons that I hope that the book has are both in terms of a way of thinking about urban space, as I just mentioned, about, you know, the city as kind of an actor, as a participant in the social relations of society. Sorry, that was not that articulate, but you know what I mean. And also, you know, kind of a larger set of values, right? Coming back to, for example, care work, like recognizing that we all of us require care and we are all also obligated and responsible to one another to provide care. And what would it look like if that was a starting principle in the city? What would it look like if we tried to bring the experiences and the needs of those who are considered, you know, the most vulnerable, the most marginalized, the most excluded, and designed from their perspective, right? Or set up our urban infrastructure to serve them. This would not in any way take anything away from that middle class, cis, able-bodied white man. Like, he's going to be fine, right? More ramps, wheelchair ramps, or accessible public transit is not going to like ruin his life in any way, but it is going to, you know, uplift so many other people's lives. So if we kind of started from the margin, right, bringing the margin to the center, rather than seeing disabled people, seniors, women, families, et cetera, as niche groups that are somehow on the fringe, if we brought those to the center, you know, how would that transform our cities? And I think, you know, those things are just as applicable in Moncton or maybe even Sackville as they are in Toronto or London.
Yeah, Leslie, thank you so much. Thank you for a great presentation. Thank you for the book. Also, thank you for the ideas, and hopefully they'll continue to percolate, not just in large cities, but also in small ones, especially here in New Brunswick, as we're thinking, you know, about what a feminist city in New Brunswick might look like. And that seems to be a question that people here really care about. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you to everyone who participated and who came tonight. It was really lovely to be here. Thank you.